a pleasure to have you all here this evening. I'm Zianne Mason. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Museum of the American Revolution, and it's such a pleasure to have our friends from FPRI back in the house tonight. I'm always curious to know, are there folks for whom this is your first visit to the museum? Okay, a few. And thank you for the many good friends that we have in the evening with us this evening that know us so well. If you haven't been here, do come back. And for those that may not have been here in the last week or so, we have a really fabulous new special exhibit that just opened about a week ago called The Cost of Revolution, The Life and Death of an Irish Soldier. And it has it's a fascinating story. Our CEO, Scott Stevenson, who had another obligation and wishes he were here this evening, calls it a psychological thriller as you follow the path of this Irish soldier who was on the wrong side of history twice, but we learn a lot from him along the way. We have so enjoyed our partnership over the years. We've only been open, as many of you know, since April of 2017, but right off the bat, we've been working with FPRI. We've done, I think, 6 the kind of debating program that we do, Debating Independence, part of the historical simulation program for high school students, which is a wonderful thing to do here. We've also had a teacher institute, which we've done in tandem with FPRI. We were honored to have Dr. McDougall with us about a year or so ago in a different room here at this building, and many of you may have been there as well. So wonderful to continue this partnership. It's my pleasure to introduce a man who likely needs no introduction to this crowd, Alan Luxemburg, who for 42 years has served the institution and since 2012 as its president. He was the man who brought so many partnerships to the fore. The Consortium on Grand Strategy, the Reserve Officers Association in Washington, D.C., Mason Crest Publishers, a publisher of books for the pre-college educational market, and founding the Walkman Center, which has served as the outlet for FPRI's educational programming, including its nationally renowned Butcher History Institute for Teachers. So we're, again, so delighted to have you, Alan. It's a pleasure to welcome you and turn things over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks to the Zianne and to the Museum of the American Revolution for hosting us once again tonight. Tonight's lecture is the 23rd lecture in a series on religion and world affairs. Began in 1996 with a donation from the late Jack Templeton. And at the time, our view was that there were a group of international relations scholars out there who did not know much about religion. And then there were a group of religion scholars out there who did not know much about international relations. And we saw it as our job to bring these groups together and somehow concoct a series of lectures that would reflect both of those disciplines in one way or another. And religion has become an important issue in international relations. Now, it turns out there's really, when you're looking at the very, very big picture, there's really no one better than our own Walter McDougall, the Eloy Anson Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the Ginsburg-Satell Chair of our Center for the Study of America and the West at FPRI, as well as co-chairman of our History Institute. He's written many great books and many brilliant essays, all of which are on our website. So if you have the time, I would urge you to look them up and spend a night every once in a while on a particular essay. Walter's one of his earliest books, The Heavens and the Earth, A Political History of the Space Age, won a Pulitzer Prize in 1987. And his latest book is The Tragedy of U.S. Foreign Policy, that was published in 2018. And somewhere in between, I remember a really fascinating book called Promised Land, Crusader State, America's Encounter with the World since 1776, which I read when it was simply a set of lectures for his class. And I said, yeah, this ought to be a book. And soon enough, he wrote the book, but he told me he had to rewrite everything. So all those lectures that I read didn't count for much because he ended up rewriting them from start to finish. Anyway, it's always a pleasure to host Walter. Just beware, he'll be speaking for a lengthy period of time tonight, so it will be well worth your time. And please welcome Walter McDougall.
Thank you, Ellen. I will relieve your anxiety. I'm going to speak for exactly 60 minutes. So the program will go a few minutes over. I'm rendered both proud and humble to be asked to add my name to the very distinguished list of Templeton lecturers over the years. And if you go on the website and look at that list, you will see what I mean. And so I'm very, very proud to have my name on that list. Most of you, I think, will remember December 31st, 1977, when Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi hosted Jimmy Carter at a state dinner in Tehran. The president took the occasion to laud Iran, a reliable U.S. ally in the Persian Gulf, as an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the admiration and love which your people have for you. Famous last words. Just a few weeks later, mass protests erupted, which metastasized into a revolution led by Shiite Muslims loyal to the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini. Nobody saw it coming, certainly not the CIA. But just 13 months after Carter's visit, the Shah was in exile and his regime replaced by a theocratic Islamic republic whose leaders denounced the United States as the Great Satan. It came as a terrible shock. But why? The revival of religious conflict in international politics was already evident in the Israeli-Palestinian, Indian-Pakistani, and Northern Irish conflicts. Indeed, Carter himself made an ecumenical appeal for peace when he brokered the 1978 Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. And events in the subsequent decade repeatedly underscored the growing role of faith-based movements. The Afghan Mujahideen, who defied the Red Army, were also Muslim jihadis. They cried, "Allahu Akbar," as they shot down Soviet helicopters. The Filipino Catholic Church was instrumental in the overthrow of the Marcos regime. Liberation theology inspired left-wing politics in Latin America. The Polish labor leader Lech Walesa and the Polish Pope John Paul II prayed for divine protection over the Solidarity movement that would topple the communist government. Lutheran churches encouraged the East German protests that toppled the Berlin Wall. In 1992, Russian Orthodox clergy and faithful babushkas, old women in Russia, shamed the soldiers sent to Moscow to overthrow Boris Yeltsin and actually helped to persuade the soldiers to desert, to disobey the coup plotters who were hoping to save the Soviet Union. In 1994, Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu was among the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. In fact, religious actors played important roles in the democratization of 48 countries between 1972 and 1972 and 2009. But the dark side of the force was just as apparent in that Iranian Revolution, in the genocidal wars in the former Yugoslavia, in the Al-Qaeda attacks of September 11, 2001, and in the insurgency following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, which belatedly educated Americans about the existence of Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims. Golly, there was an ancient schism we didn't even, almost no Americans actually even knew about. And during those decades, scholars in the field of international relations were obliged to admit that seemingly atavistic religious convictions still mattered. Titles like these began to appear, one after another. Religion, the missing dimension of statecraft. Faith and diplomacy in the international system. Religion and security, the new nexus in international relations. Nations under God, the geopolitics of faith in the 21st century, and a turn to religion in international relations, question mark? Well, very prominent, very prestigious political scientists acknowledged the prior shortcomings of their discipline. Jack Snyder wrote, and yet the main canonical works of international relations theory, which continue to shape much empirical academic work, hardly mention religion. The foundational statements of the three leading paradigms, realism, liberalism, and constructivism, offer no explicit guidance on how to do this, and in some cases imply that a role for religion may not be allowable within the logics of their paradigms, unquote. Likewise, Robert Jervis wrote, terrorism grounded in religion poses special problems for modern social science, which has paid little attention to religion, perhaps because most social scientists find the subject uninteresting, if not embarrassing, unquote. Likewise, Edward Luttwak observed, policymakers, diplomats, journalists, and scholars who are ready to overinterpret economic causality, political affiliations, are still in the habit of disregarding the role of religion, unquote. Even today, 4 decades after the Iranian Revolution and 2 decades since 9/11, IR theorists have still made little progress towards some new general theory in which religious motivation is treated as an independent variable. What academics have mostly accomplished is recite truisms. For instance, religion is relevant to all conflict as it concerns life and death. Religious conflicts tend to have higher levels of intensity. Wars are longer in duration when religion is a major factor. Over half of all contemporary conflicts have some significant religious dimension, etc., etc. Or else, social scientists have displayed their worst tendency, which is to generate gobbledygook. Quote, the neo-Weberian and other dialogical ethics-based approaches, in turn, point to the internal workings and tensions as well as internal-external interactions of religious traditions in their contexts. In a similar vein, we assert that studies of religion in international relations, in order to avoid bad, good, problematic, beneficial, conflict-prone, peaceful dichotomies, should instead treat religion as a socially constructed practice and discourse, unquote. Why have IR theorists been so blind to the role of religion, both before and since the 1970s? At least 5 causes leap to mind. First, as Alan mentioned, the paucity of academics and practitioners who have expertise in both fields. Those with a deep understanding of one or more religious traditions usually lack knowledge or experience of the rough and tumble of politics, while those who are wise in the ways of statecraft are often out of their depth in spiritual matters. Second, a profound disconnect hampers analyses of the phenomenon because diplomacy is imminent, and it's an arena of power with discernible material stakes, whereas religion is transcendent, an arena of faith in which motives and outcomes are unpredictable and immeasurable. Thus, religion is an unwelcome intruder, confounding rational models of world politics based on balance of power, economic self-interest, or comparative sociology. A third source of blindness is the tendency of Western intellectuals to think in dichotomies, setting realism and idealism, or the secular and the religious, against each other as if they were mutually exclusive. In fact, the most profound Christian students of moral theology, from Thomas Aquinas to Reinhold Niebuhr, have always understood that whatever is unrealistic, that is to say, contrary to natural law, cannot, by definition, be moral. The implication of their insight is that in statecraft, the utopian pursuit of moral perfection through diplomacy or war is perversely to invite immoral results. A truly moral statecraft must accept the flawed human nature, pursue limited aims, and acknowledge the contingency of all human creation. But unfortunately, the binary bias of most Western thought inhibits such subtle balance. A fourth source of the blindness has been the unwarranted assumption since the late 19th century that a decline of religion is an inevitable byproduct of modernization. Whether they're followers of Karl Marx or followers of Max Weber, they tended to dismiss religion as the opiate of the masses or some equivalent. What they failed to realize was opiates are addictive. It took the Ayatollah Khomeini to state the obvious in 1978, quote, "The masses are naturally drawn to religion," unquote. Now, Max Weber was right about lots of stuff. He was surely right to observe that industrial management, modern science, secular schools, and government agencies were taking over the epistemological, psychological, or social duties previously performed by religious institutions. So in functional terms, it seemed modern societies no longer had much need for religion. But religion functions far more profoundly as a source of meaning, purpose, and hope for human beings. So modernization theorists such as Walt Rostow, who argued in the 1950s and 60s that the process of secularization was inevitable and that it would essentially be similar for all countries, such views were profoundly wrong. Not only has religion survived in the third world, it has even survived, to a certain degree, here in America. Well, other scholars made room for religion, but only as a dependent variable. For instance, the famous historian Emanuel Wallerstein described the uneven effects that inequitable capitalist markets have on locales around the world, and he interpreted the occasional religious revivals that sprang up as psychological expressions of helplessness. Well, that seems plausible, but such structuralism still left no room for cult and culture as genuine inspirations. Likewise, the Frankfurt School of critical theorists focused on cultural evolution, but only within the context of socio-economic change. They noted that during the era of high industrialization, the more advanced societies did display the expected retreat of religion. But in what Jürgen Habermas called the postmodern era, advanced societies have now shifted their focus from questions of productivity and distribution to quality of life issues, such as the environment or expressive individualism. Hence, the renewed interest that we see is not in dogmatic religion per se, but rather a vague spirituality. We've all read articles about this. You know, the kids, they don't go to church or synagogue anymore, but they all say that they're somehow spiritual. Well, that does appear to be true to a great degree for Western Europe, or for Europe in general, and for North America. But that theory hardly applies to Muslim fundamentalists who are in rebellion against the postmodern West. Finally, a fifth source of the embarrassing blindness, which you may not be familiar with, is an old Enlightenment myth about the birth of the modern international system. According to that myth, the system sprang to life like Athena from the head of Zeus in the year 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia brought to a close the age of religious wars in Europe. According to that myth, there had been 120 years of warfare between Protestants and Catholics that had been so destructive, Europe's monarchs cried never again and abruptly converted to secular principles, such as state sovereignty, raison d'etat, and the balance of power. But the truth, as Edward Luttwak observed, was that myth had to be ruthlessly imposed. Quote, Enlightenment publicists and philosophers, beginning in the 18th century, wielded none of the torture instruments of the Catholic Inquisitions, but when it came to religion in all its aspects, they successfully strangled free inquiry just as effectively by the commanding force of the fashion they imposed, unquote. And sure enough, ever since, scholars of diplomatic history, political theory, and international law have perpetuated that myth so relentlessly that the recent literature about diplomacy and religion still parrots it. Thus, we read in the authoritative Oxford Encyclopedia on International Relations that IR theorists trace the system of sovereign states back to the Peace of Westphalia, when temporal and spiritual authority were severed. Henceforth, religion played no role in great power politics except as a fig leaf, cloaking the real motives rooted in power and wealth. Flip through almost any work of IR theory, and you'll find some version of this postulate. Quote, the treaties of Westphalia established national sovereignty, political realism, and raison d'etat as the main principles of statecraft by replacing religion. Indeed, the Westphalian settlement established a political theology for modern international relations, unquote. A 2003 book called The Sacred and the Sovereign begins with a ritual bow to Westphalia as the fontes et origo of modern diplomacy. It then goes on to describe this historic sea change. Prior to Westphalia, we read, the medieval archetype, or res publica Christiana, rested on four principles. First, faith and reason, or religion and politics, were not antagonistic, but ideally cooperative. Second, all authority vested in church and state derived from God. Third, temporal, political, and legal rule was an intermingling of overlapping authorities and jurisdictions. In short, the feudal system. And fourth, civilization was assumed to be coextensive with Christendom. But, we read, the Protestant Reformation fractured that medieval archetype and replaced it with a modern archetype that rested on four very different principles. First, faith and reason are not cooperative because religion is now viewed as divisive and destructive. Second, authority is no longer derived solely from God. Third, temporal, political, and legal rule is now rigidly confined to territorial sovereign states. And fourth, religious affinity is now tethered to the territorial state rather than to a transnational church hierarchy. And if any proof is needed that Westphalia worked such a revolution, writes the author, one need only quote Innocent X, the Pope of the time, whose papal bull damned the treaties of Westphalia as, quote, null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, and inane, empty of meaning and effect for all time, unquote. Now, my purpose is not to be condescending toward my colleagues in political science, but too often they simply stipulate an oversimplified version of events that historians have long ago discarded. That is why the question must now be asked, what was the Peace of Westphalia anyway? It was simply the collective term applied to three separate treaties negotiated in the North German towns, roughly around here, in Westphalia, of Osnabrück and Münster in the year 1648. Those treaties brought to an end the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the 80 Years' War for Dutch independence from Spain. We're celebrating the American Revolution. We fought for 8 years, 1775 to 83, to win our independence. The Dutch had to fight for 80 years. But finally, as part of the Peace of Westphalia, they achieved their independence. Now, what was the Holy Roman Empire? It dated from the year 843, when the Treaty of Verdun divided Charlemagne's early medieval realm among three grandsons. Each got a kingdom, but only one could inherit the imperial title, and it turned out to be Otto the German. Throughout the medieval era, therefore, Germany's rulers had universal pretensions, and the most powerful of them expanded the imperial boundaries into the Low Countries and Italy. Whoops. Oh, gee. Help. There we are. In the Low Countries up here in the northwest of Europe and in the Italian states down in southern Europe. And consequently, the power of the emperors clashed directly in Italy with the powers of the papacy. The emperors also tried repeatedly to centralize the Holy Roman Empire, to impose their own will on the entire empire, and that brought them into conflict with their own vassals, the lesser German princes. Well, in the year 1356, those princes promulgated the so-called Golden Bull, which made the office of Holy Roman Emperor elective. There were 7 princes, 4 of them secular, 3 of them clerical, who were made electors. And in the ensuing centuries, they habitually exploited their leverage to extract concessions from their habitual choice for emperor, the Habsburg Dukes of Austria. But as it happened over those same centuries, the Habsburg dynasty acquired so many kingdoms and provinces, and through the Kingdom of Spain, after Columbus, the entire New World colonies, that their power had become nearly hegemonic. And so it was in the years after Martin Luther launched the Reformation in 1517, the great Emperor Charles V resisted in the name of both Catholic unity and imperial unity. A generation of war ensued, but the Lutheran princes survived. They held out against the emperor until the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, which established the principle cuius regio eius religio, whose realm, his religion, throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Well, 3 of the electors, the rulers of Brandenburg, Saxony, and the Palatinate, had become Protestant, but the other 4 remained Catholic until 1618, when Bohemia's nobility dared to elect a Calvinist as their own king. Bohemia, right here, Kingdom of Bohemia. And that tipped the scale. Now the Protestants would have a majority, and future elections would presumably reject the Catholic Habsburgs. Once again, the Habsburg emperors, this clicker has a hair trigger. Okay. The Catholic emperors had no choice but to resist. And sure enough, in 1620, their army crushed the Czechs at the Battle of the White Mountain. That proved only the beginning, because Protestants, both German and foreign, intervened, while the emperor escalated the war by again trying to centralize the Holy Roman Empire. 3 decades of war ensued, during which Germany was repeatedly ravaged and 1/3 of its population perished. The Protestant Danes, the Protestant Swedes, the Protestant Dutch all entered the war at various phases. And then in 1642, Cardinal Richelieu brought in Catholic France as well. But, and here's the kicker, on the Protestant side. Why? Because the French monarchy had long since followed the allegedly modern strategy of balance of power with respect to the mighty Habsburg Empire. And the French kings had long since functioned as sovereigns, just like the kings of England, Scotland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Russia had all done. The notion that state sovereignty was somehow invented by the Westphalian treaties is just fanciful. What did triumph was sovereignty for the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, whose control over most, not all, state functions were now recognized by the emperor. Otherwise, the century-old Augsburg formula of cuius regio eius religio was reconfirmed and life went on. Well, the Peace of Westphalia was an important watershed, but it's nonsense to suggest that it ushered in a whole new era of statecraft. Imagine, as early as 1536, King Francis I of France allied with the Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, so they could coordinate their attacks on the Habsburgs. And a century later, when Richelieu allied France with Germany's Protestants, France was simultaneously waging a war against Catholic Spain. Other European monarchs had routinely fought wars against fellow Catholics for reasons that had nothing to do with religion. Just consider the famous 100 Years' War between England and France. And even the so-called wars of religion were driven by some powerful secular motives, not least the desire by the Protestant princes to seize the Catholic Church's vast accumulations of land and wealth. Likewise, the French wars of religion were civil conflicts over the throne, and the ultimate victor, the Protestant Henri de Bourbon, assumed the throne of France in 1589, I believe, but then happily converted back to Catholicism because most of his subjects were still Catholic. He then issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598 to extend tolerance to the Protestant Huguenots in France. So all of this predated 1648. The Dutch rebellion against Spain that I mentioned was waged as much for political and economic freedom as for religious freedom. Then there's the English Civil War from 1642 to 1660. Oh, it might have been a Presbyterian crusade under Oliver Cromwell, but it began and ended as a political quarrel between Crown and Parliament. And as for the myth that Westphalia ended the power of the church, the fact that Innocent X cursed the treaties was as laughable then as it is now, because papal power had been in eclipse for some 200 years. First, during the late Middle Ages, the papacy had fallen under the thumb of secular rulers. First, in its so-called Babylonian captivity at Avignon, and then the schism between rival popes, one backed by France, the other by the Habsburg Empire, by the Holy Roman Empire. And then there was the corruption of the Renaissance popes. To be sure, the prestige of the Vatican recovered somewhat under the great reforms of the Council of Trent, but the popes had long since ceased to influence high politics, great power politics in Europe. The Spanish Inquisition, for instance, was precisely that, Spanish, not papal, and it had been created by Ferdinand and Isabella after 1492 to root out Muslims and Jews in Spain because the monarchs assumed that religious dissidents would become potentially political dissidents. Well, let's turn now from the era that preceded Westphalia to the one that followed. Is it possible to discern a striking new emphasis on respect for sovereignty, raison d'etat, and the balance of power? Well, certainly the founders of international law, Hugo Grotius, Samuel Pufendorf, and Immanuel Kant, hoped that it would. But the reality was often otherwise. In 1685, now we're talking about after Westphalia, Louis XIV betrayed his own raison d'etat when he revoked the Edict of Nantes and drove 1 million prosperous Huguenots out of his kingdom for fear that they would become politically disloyal. Likewise, the English Whigs, who exiled James II in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, did so because he had reverted to Catholicism. So just as religion did not dominate European politics before 1648, neither did it disappear after 1648. Well, is it fair to say that religious sectarianism at least retreated during the high Enlightenment of the 18th century? Well, yeah, probably. But the hyperbolic French Revolution carried the tyranny of reason to such extremes that Europeans elsewhere rallied behind their traditional thrones and altars. The propaganda of the Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and British monarchies routinely depicted the French Republic as godless and Napoleon as the Antichrist. And over that quarter century of revolution and war, there arose a new cultural movement called Romanticism, whose spirit permeated the diplomacy of the era of restoration that followed. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, Tsar Alexander I sponsored a mystical holy alliance to bind the Orthodox Russian monarch with Prussia's Lutheran king and Austria's Catholic emperor in a Christian brotherhood. In France, the monarchy and church were restored to power, and Romantic philosophers such as Robert de Lamennais and François-René de Chateaubriand imagined a politics derived from the génie, the genius of Christianity. England produced a host of Christian romantics, Samuel Coleridge probably most prominently, while the piety of Victorian statesmen would become a cliché. In Russia, Nicholas II proclaimed orthodoxy the bedrock of his regime, and Louis Napoleon, who came to power during the Revolution of 1848, nevertheless, as one of his first acts, dispatched a French army to Rome to serve as the Pope's bodyguard against revolution. Well, the era of German unification in the 1860s and 70s is generally considered to have been the heyday of realpolitik, power politics. No trace of religion or even morality in this era. And yet, Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German unity, was an adult convert, his wife had converted him, and who insisted that he was a Christian statesman. To be sure, a Prussian liberal quipped Bismarck's God had the remarkable faculty of always agreeing with him, but Bismarck never doubted that by serving his king, he was serving God. And his contemporary, Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, tried scrupulously to conform his foreign policies to biblical morality. As a result, he made a whole series of well-meaning blunders. But that did not dissuade the young Woodrow Wilson from naming Gladstone his beau ideal, his role model. Now, during those decades, the United States was beginning to emerge as a world power. And in 1898, the Cuban revolt against Spain tempted Americans to intervene. President William McKinley resisted the clamor for war until the Congress, the Navy, and public opinion forced his hand. But that public opinion was shaped to a very large degree by Protestant clergy. Protestant clergy who longed for the United States to slay the Catholic dragon in Cuba and save the damsel in distress. And that inspired McKinley not only to go to war, but to preside over a wholesale reformation of what I call the American civil religion. McKinley, followed by Theodore Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson, jettisoned foreign policy traditions dating all the way back to George Washington. This is the Promised Land Crusader State theme that I developed that Alan referred to. They now jettisoned all of that and instead justified war and even American imperialism in terms of the Protestant social gospel. And they exhorted Americans to be good imperialists and to take up the white man's burden, following the British lead. Rudyard Kipling, of course, the British poet, had coined that phrase and sent the poem over to Theodore Roosevelt to try to convince the United States to get in the business of uplifting the poor, downtrodden colonial peoples of the world. Well, this narrative now brings us, chronologically, to perhaps the most counterintuitive example of the mix between religion and statecraft. The catastrophe that nearly all historians and political scientists have always traced to nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and hubris. Yes, even World War I turns out to have been a clash of religions, although largely now civil religions. Most people think of the Great War, that the Great War only became a religious crusade, a war to end war, with President Wilson when he led the United States into the battle in 1917. But Kaiser Wilhelm II expressed his own nation's creed when he proclaimed to the Reichstag at the start of the war, quote, "So now I commend you to God. Go into your churches, kneel before God, and implore his help for our brave army," unquote. Lutheran pastor Johann Kessler was just one of many Germans whose wartime best-selling books argued that the German cause was the holy one. Quote, "We believe in the world calling of our nation, a nation that God has equipped with such gifts of the Spirit that he called it to bear the gospel in the days of the Reformation, that he chose it in the War of Liberation against Napoleon, a nation to which God has given a Luther and a Lessing, a Goethe and a Schiller, a Kant and a Bismarck. This nation cannot be cast aside. God has great things in store for such a nation that could defy a world of enemies and still prevail," unquote. Pastor Adolf von Hanark wrote speeches for the Kaiser that even justified Germany's brutal attack on Belgium. And, as you probably know, German soldiers famously marched into battle with Gott mit uns, God with us, on their belts, and the war cry, Gott strafe England, on their lips. May God smite England. Tsar Nicholas II. There he is. Famously rallied his soldiers with reverent displays of holy icons. In 1914, British soldiers at the Battle of Mons claimed to have visions of angels helping them resist the German advance. And all the monarchs and their leaders, the leaders of their national churches, and the chaplains in their militaries, and to judge from their letters, many of the soldiers in the trenches prayed for God's blessing in a war all believed was being fought in self-defense against a demonic enemy. But not until 2014 did historian Philip Jenkins publish a book. a little out of order, called the Great and Holy War, which marshaled the evidence for this startling hypothesis. Quote, "The First World War was a thoroughly religious event, in the sense that overwhelmingly Christian nations fought each other in what many viewed as a holy war. Religion is essential to understanding why people went to war, what they hoped to achieve through war, why they stayed at war. Not in the medieval or Reformation times, but in the age of aircraft and machine guns, the majority of the world's Christians were indeed engaged in a holy war, which claimed more than 10 million lives." Unquote. His book shows, moreover, how the war transformed Judaism and Islam as well, and in effect redrew the religious map of the world. How was it that 266 years after the Peace of Westphalia, Europeans and their overseas empires went to war in the service of their God as well as their country? Why did they remain in the trenches long after it became obvious that this was a bloody, muddy war of attrition whose cost far exceeded any conceivable fruits of victory? Well, the second question, if you think about it, answers itself. The sacrifices proved so great that only victory could redeem them. The enemy was so evil that no truce or compromise was conceivable, and the cause for which they were fighting was so sacred it could not be abandoned. But as to the first question, why the clergies of the various countries urged their flocks to enlist and otherwise do their patriotic duty, the answer can only be that they had long since made their peace with the modern secular state. During the long 19th century, as nationalist ideologies gradually spread, the established churches in England, Germany, and Russia obediently perceived no difference between rendering unto God and rendering unto Caesar. To be sure, the Catholic popes did repeatedly denounce nationalism, along with capitalism and socialism, for instance, in the Syllabus of Errors of 1864 and in the encyclical Rerum Novarum of 1891. But the Vatican also compromised by making concordats with the Austrian and German governments, while in 1892, Leo XIII even instructed French Catholics in the anti-clerical Third Republic to obey their secular authorities. And by 1914, it had just become unthinkable for any significant Christian authority to stand athwart its nation's war effort. As a result, the war was catastrophic for the churches, because millions of Europeans emerged from it deeply disillusioned by clergy who had turned the cross into a bayonet and baptized its bloody work. But the war did not turn Europeans into atheists. Jenkins explains that supernatural themes not only survived the war, but flourished. The problem was that Europeans began pursuing passionate notions, messianic, even millenarian notions, which threatened to take secular form. Left in a state of anomie or emptiness after this apocalyptic war, many Europeans fled to political religions, fascism, communism, National Socialism, all of which exploited twisted versions of Christian iconography, doctrine, and liturgy. By the 1930s, the Catholic Church was on the defensive, the Protestant churches were being hollowed out, and the Orthodox Church had been crucified by the Bolsheviks. So if secularization triumphed in the end, it was not because of modernization. It was because of the Great War, waged with the collusion of the churches themselves. less well known, but just as tectonic were the earthquakes triggered by the war in the Middle East. For there, the mosque was recruited in the service of the Ottoman war effort, even though the Turkish government was now led by secular modernizers, indeed the Young Turks. When the Ottoman Empire joined the war as Germany's ally in 1914, Sultan Mehmed V assumed his role as caliph of all Islam and solemnly proclaimed a jihad. Quote, "Right and loyalty are on our side, hatred and tyranny on the side of our enemies. And therefore there is no doubt that the divine help and assistance of the just God, of Allah, and the moral support of our glorious prophet will be on our side to encourage us. Let those of you who are to die a martyr's death be messengers of victory to those who have gone before, and let the victory be sacred and the sword be sharp for those of you who are to remain in life," unquote. Well, the Ottoman army, stiffened by German advisors, defeated the British Empire's 1915 Gallipoli invasion in the Straits, Turkish Straits up here. That was the operation by which Winston Churchill had hoped to capture Constantinople. But by 1917, British forces down in Egypt were stirring up Arab revolts against Turkish rule, and General Edmund Allenby was preparing to invade the Sanjak, or province, of Jerusalem. A mystic himself, Allenby imagined the campaign the culmination of the medieval Crusades. English and American Protestants, especially Christian Zionists, were especially excited. One image, you see it here, celebrated the beginning of Hanukkah 1917 by depicting two heroes in parallel: Judas Maccabeus entering Jerusalem in 165 BCE and General Allenby in 1917, beneath a caption quoting the prophet Isaiah, "And there will come for Zion a Redeemer." Indeed, the blessed event occurred just a month after Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour assured the Zionist Federation that, quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people," unquote. Well, after the war, the British did rule Palestine as a League of Nations mandate, which meant a Jewish return to the Promised Land became a real possibility. But at the same time, the collapse of the Ottoman dynasty brought with it the end of the Caliphate, the fracture of the Ummat al-Islam, the worldwide Muslim community, and the rise of radical, often violent, Arab religious movements. The concatenation of those events thus presaged both the exodus of European Jews to the Holy Land and the resistance they would face from the Arabs and, periodically, the British themselves. Now, Zionism predated the Great War, as did modern anti-Semitism. But the social and psychological stress of the war stoked an upsurge of anti-Semitism in all the belligerent powers, in spite of the fact that their Jewish communities were making big contributions to the various war efforts, both in uniform and in the professions. As a consequence, Zionism spread rapidly. Indeed, in the year 1900, consider this redistribution, Europe had been home to over 80% of the world's Jews. But this upsurge in anti-Semitism marked the start of a great redistribution, such that by 2019, over 80% of the world's Jews now reside in Israel and the United States. In the 1920s alone, some 120,000 Jews moved to the British Mandate until they had become 1/6 of the population. Arab resistance movements, including the suicidal Fedayeen, sprang up as early as 1920. In the interwar years, a modicum of order was imposed on the Middle East because the British and the French patronized local Arab chiefs and, of course, policed their own mandates. But leaders like Ibn Saud, who captured Mecca in 1924 and promoted the Wahhabi sect, had their own agendas, apart from the colonial powers. So due to the First World War, the gestation of the modern Middle East began, long before the Nazi Holocaust to come. The Great War brought immediate holocausts to Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Armenians and Anatolian Greeks, among the oldest Christian communities, had lived more or less peacefully under the Turks' tolerant millet system for minorities. I read this statistic, I can scarcely believe it, that as late as 1914, the city of Constantinople was 50% Christian and 5% Jewish. But when the Sultan gambled the empire's future by joining the Holy War, the regime turned against minorities of dubious loyalty, non-Muslims. Over a 6-month period in 1915, an estimated 1.2 million Armenians were hanged, shot, starved, drowned, or burned. According to the American consul, who caught glimpses of the carnage, quote, "The Mohammedans, in their fanaticism, seemed determined not only to exterminate the Christian population, but to remove all traces of their religion and civilization," unquote. And when the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 enabled a secular nationalist movement under Kemal Ataturk to take power, it was the turn of the Anatolian Greeks. To be sure, the Greek prime minister in Athens, Venizelos, and the British government, which encouraged him, deserve a lot of the blame. They hoped to exploit the Sultan's defeat by forging a sort of new Byzantine empire, a Greek empire in Anatolia. Ataturk's nationalists fought back ferociously, and over a 3-year span, visited death or exile on 1.3 million Greek Orthodox. So the real watershed in the relation between religion and international politics would appear to be World War I, not the Peace of Westphalia. For World War I was the moment when traditional Christian institutions, compromised by their state's civil religions, endorsed total war, with the result that the belligerents emerged from the trenches utterly disillusioned. And that's why the Second World War that erupted in Europe took the form of a profane, not sacred, slugfest among ideologies. And the only nations that emerged with their civil religions intact from the First World War were those who had suffered least and gained the most: Imperial Japan and the United States. Hence, the Pacific War, World War II in the Pacific, did take the form of another holy war between civil religions. And after that war, only one God was left standing: the American one, which is what enabled the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy administrations to mobilize civil religious fervor during the long twilight struggle against godless communism. The presidents even made explicit promises, prophecies really, of a coming heaven on earth, so long as the American people gritted their teeth and stayed the course. Communism that would someday collapse, whereupon all nations would embrace peace, democracy, and free markets. In effect, the American dream. And sure enough, that was the end of history proclaimed by Francis Fukuyama in 1989. What have we witnessed in the 30 years since? Backlashes against American-led globalization on the part of Muslim terrorists, communist holdouts, and revisionist powers like Russia, China, and Iran. Samuel Huntington saw some of that coming when he presciently wrote in 1993 that a clash of civilizations would be the defining feature of world politics following the Cold War's clash of ideologies. But just a year later, James Kurth was even more prescient when he imagined the real clash would not be between the West and the rest, but within Western civilization, and especially its core, the United States. Kurth described, here's Sam Huntington up here, Kurth described how Americans had invented the concept of Western civilization precisely during the Holy War of the Great War of 1914-1918. Universities like Columbia began a whole curricula around Western civilization and identified it with the values of the Reformation, Enlightenment, scientific and industrial revolutions, and liberal government, all, of course, most perfectly realized in the U.S. Woodrow Wilson's wartime propaganda summarized all that as the American Creed, which went on to legitimize American power throughout its so-called heroic age from 1917 to 1991. But, Kurth argued, successive generations, beginning with my baby boomers and culminating in the millennials, ceased to think of the U.S. as the core or even as a member of a civilization in which they had now ceased to believe. Redefining Euro-American history in terms of imperialism, militarism, racism, and sexism, they no longer promoted assimilation for legal immigrants and began to promote multiculturalism for illegal ones. Kurth anticipated the tyranny of expressive individualism, the deconstruction of gender, and intersectionality in American politics. Amazing. All this is written way back around 1994. So thorough has been the loss of faith on the part of progressives in the rule of law, free markets, and old-fashioned liberalism that Kurth asked in conclusion how many Americans would be willing to fight in Huntington's clash of civilizations since they and their elites had now jettisoned their own. Well, if that was a chilling observation 25 years ago, what's the prognosis today? In 2015, a political scientist provided a useful breakdown of the basic dynamics between religions and regimes. They ranged, he said, from totalitarian atheism on one extreme to theocracy on the other extreme, with various kinds of civil religious synergy in the middle. He had no category at all for regimes that simply permit genuine free exercise of religion. Nor did he have a category for ecumenism, whose brief 20th century moment is long dead. Nor did he entertain the possibility of cross-cultural conversion through missionary work. Well, do any world religions today have the potential to make serious inroads in other civilizations? Here the answer is demonstrably yes. Christianity and Islam are both transportable, evangelical faiths that are presently competing for conversions throughout sub-Saharan Africa. But Christianity is no longer promoted by any of the great powers, while the Muslim states compete with each other across sectarian, strategic, or political lines. And yet, now we're moving into the area of total speculation. One might think that perhaps there is one other faith that does have widespread appeal, at least throughout much of Asia, does have a great power champion, and may have the potential to become the first transcultural civil religion. What is it? It is faith in what Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew called Asian values, but are more precisely called Chinese values. China. whether imperial, nationalist, or communist, has never had an articulated civil religion because China is a civil religion. People are born into it and nurtured by it. People worship their own ancestors and are worshipped in turn after they die. Moreover, the fetching values that China espouses include hierarchy, authority, family loyalty, communal and national solidarity, elevation of social stability over personal freedom, thrift, education, and a relentless work ethic. It's totally counterintuitive to Americans, especially with what's going on in Hong Kong right now. But Asian values eloquently reflect many of the realities of natural law, as opposed to the defiance of reality that in the West has smothered Judeo-Christian values in the name of expressive individualism. Those Asian values are not tethered to any theological doctrines, holy scriptures, or specific commandments. Hence, they are adaptable across a wide variety of socioeconomic and political conditions. Finally, although Asian values date back to the Qin Empire in the 3rd century BCE, they appear to be very compatible with cutting-edge technologies of the 21st century, including artificial intelligence, big data, 5G telecommunications, total surveillance, including facial recognition, and a social credit system that rewards mutuality and punishes individuality. Asian values are what Xi Jinping's regime currently advertise through its global web of Confucius institutes. Campuses all around the world have their Confucius institutes, and which it currently exports through its Made in China 2025 program and its famous Belt and Road Initiative. Now today, it's customary for American pundits to declare we're on the cusp of a new Cold War. Oh, but that's something that Deng Xiaoping predicted 3 decades ago. And if we are entering a new Cold War, then the civilization formerly known as Western will be in big trouble. For the civil religion that inspired Americans through their first Cold War effort has today ceased to exist at the very conjuncture when the United States must confront, for the first time in its brief history, a post-humiliation, post-Maoist, mighty, authentic China. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. We have a few minutes for questions. Just wait for the microphone to come to you. Murray. Right there.
First of all, that was the very definition of a tour de force. Thank you very much. A simple question. One of the religions, and it appears at the present time to be tied to state power, that you did not mention is Hindu nationalism and Hinduism. Where does that fit into the picture that you painted here at the end, as you say, speculatively?
That's a very good question. I don't know very much about India, I'll readily admit. Again, the first temptation that I have as a scholar is to fall back into that traditional IR theory, mode, and say, well, he's using Hinduism for political reasons, at home. But to the extent that he pushes the Pax to the brink of war, there's more here than just political opportunism. and beyond that, I really can't say. But it does mean the I don't know what you want to call it, the resurgence of a kind of an assertive or aggressive Hinduism certainly is a big barrier. It's a big barrier to the spread of Asian values. These are not really Asian values; these are Chinese values, and the Hindus want no part of them, even though they share many of the characteristics in terms of Asian values. And how much the Chinese themselves really believe that they can sort of they can expand their civilization along with their economic and military power, as they seem to be trying to do through the Confucius Institutes and political outreach as far as East Africa, for instance, or even Eastern Europe, is imponderable. I have a feeling the Chinese are engaging in massive overreach in that regard, because the clash of civilizations that Huntington wrote about is there. It's real. Russian Orthodoxy is a good example, and the other civilizations, based in turn on their own religions, it seems to me, are more likely to rise up and get more, assertive in defense against any aggressor, whether it be Western postmodern globalism or a Chinese bid for cultural superiority.
Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Thank you. First, thank you very much for such an incredibly interesting and important discussion. It's the kind of thing that all of us, I'm sure, will be going back and looking at your video, et cetera, to take in. But I wanted to talk about a connection to the Confucian Institutes, because I see them with different eyes, I think, than you do. And so my experience with them, I went back and forth to China many times in the last 30 years or so. And in the beginning, my sense was to visit all the special places in Beijing. And of course, the Confucian Center, the training of Confucian, the whole idea of the administration of traditional China was based upon the Confucian concepts that were involved in training. So I went to that original site. Well, I can tell you that the original site had grass, weeds growing up through the sidewalks. It was in such poor condition that you couldn't imagine it. You couldn't imagine more a sense of abandonment of something. And I saw that, and that was very striking to me, and I could never forget that. And then, being also a student of world religions, I also saw the absence, of course, of that thread clearly as a major piece of what China's all about, and still see it that way. That the lack of a sense of purpose, the grand sense of purpose that religion provides, was missing, and it was clear to me they were searching. And the search was finally centered in on reviving Confucian centers as a way of connecting the Chinese people to their past and a broader sense of purpose for their future. But I saw my impression, I wanted to get your sense of this, is that the Confucian centers really are a put-on thing, applied in a way to try and get something going in order to have this connection with the past, but it's not working really well. No. And they're putting a lot into it, just as China puts into a lot of these things. So my question of you is do you really see a future for these Confucian centers being the way in which this is going to work in the future?
Probably not. I don't know very much about them. I've not done a study of them. I certainly don't think they have much influence on American campuses or European campuses. Whether they have any influence at all in Southeast Asia, or elsewhere in the Belt and Road kind of countries, I don't know. But the cultural imperialism, if you will, is a very hard thing to pull off, as Westerners have learned to their sorrow ever since the colonial era, and I am more than ready to kind of bow to your expertise with regard to the Confucius Institutes. As I said at the end of the paper, I'm now entering into the area of total speculation about what the future may hold. I think that the current regime in China is experimenting, you might say, with these forms of what we would call soft power, but I don't think they're having much success. You're right.
We have time for one more question. You in the back? Right here. Right here.
Thank you. Walt, I wanted to talk about the subject of the decline of Christianity in the United States. And I've, in my own mind, and I'd like to get your comments on this, is that number one, I remember in the 50s, virtually all respectable people went to church on Sunday. And something happened in the 60s, Vietnam, where people suddenly said, oh, we're not the saviors of the world, as we were in World War II, and caused a doubt, if you will, of America's moral standing in the world. And the second thing is the question just of immigration. When Lyndon Johnson in 1965 changed the immigration law, and it was no longer culturally based, racially based, and so the 90% of white population in this country has now become 50% or whatever. And the question is, well, now none of these people come, or very few of them, come as Christians, and do we have to have a special way of making sure that nobody gets offended to try to keep civil society together? And so the combination of these two things taking place in the 60s have struck me as really key in seeing a decline of religion ever since. Could you comment on that?
That's a huge topic, a huge question. I would urge you first of all to read my new book, which deals at some length with all of those trends. But I guess from a kind of a big think perspective, I would say all of the trends that you've described were unintended consequences of the clash between sectarian faith, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, whatever, and American civil faith. American civil faith was never promoted more openly, more overtly, more politically than during the Cold War, when we were mobilizing, the God believers around the world, not just Christians and Jews, but also we hoped in the 1950s and 60s to enlist the Muslim world against the godless communists, and meanwhile we had all of these problems at home: discrimination, segregation, overt racism in many cases, and of course poverty. And the United States was presenting itself to the world as the great model of truth, justice, and the American way, prosperity, the can-do nation, better than communism. Third world countries, be like us, don't be like them, and these warts on the face of American society became very embarrassing. So we've got to do away with the warts. We've got to have a war on poverty. We've got to have civil rights. And then one thing led to another, as you say, under the influence of the Vietnam War and the disillusionment. I would certainly throw in the sexual revolution, and the youth bulge, the baby boom youth bulge. All of this, and of course the march of technology, all of this came together to overwhelm traditional forms of worship. And the faith that presumably lay behind them, but the demographic changes born of not only immigration, but abortion. Most white people are not reproducing themselves anymore. If it weren't for the Mormons, I don't know that we'd have any population growth at all. And the person who was most responsible for the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act wasn't Lyndon Johnson, although obviously he supported it and signed it. It was Ted Kennedy.
Okay, thank you very much. A lecture by Walter McDougall is always a unique experience. Some of you have probably heard me say that a good historian is one who makes the unfamiliar familiar, and a great historian makes the familiar unfamiliar. Well, I think you've had 500 years of history that you thought were familiar, but now you know are unfamiliar. So join me in thanking Walter McDougall.